I thought when I met her she was possibly one of the last people alive who'd grown up or had living memory of the Burrells Walk estate. In fact, there are several people who are still alive who were born on the estate. And Edna is still alive. She celebrated her 100th birthday earlier this year. So I feel really privileged to have met her, but since then I've also met several other people, and it would have been lovely to have included them in the film, but that's the way it goes. The second thing I wanted to mention was you were told about the embroideries in the Museum of Cambridge. We're very, very lucky to have a temporary loan of 3 of those embroideries on display here in the cabinet for tonight only. But again, that's a really precious living link with those men that we saw in those vivid photographs. The embroidery was part of their therapy, the attempt to keep them occupied, to keep their morale up, and so forth. And the Museum of Cambridge has about half a dozen of these embroideries. We don't know anything at all about the men who made them, really, but they are in really good condition. So please do have a look at those before you leave. So I'm willing to answer any questions if I can, if anyone wants to. Yes?
I was treated for appendicitis in a military hospital, but not here in Cambridge, but at Red Hill. And there were many war wounded there. And my recollection of it as a child there in the hospital was the tremendous cheerfulness of the war wounded there, who spent all their time gossiping with each other and flirting with the nurses. And it was a very cheerful atmosphere, and I think people were relieved to be out of the fighting for a bit. But this was the Second World War. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is a more gloomy prospect, and that is, since it's mentioned in the film that almost all the buildings here were constructed of asbestos, I wonder how many of the people who lived on and who were treated in the hospital and who lived on the estate subsequently have died of asbestosis.
Indeed. Well, Edna's made it to her 100th birthday. That's all I have to say. And she's not alone. I mean, the other people, are catching her up in age. But yes, the building, the structure of the building, it was known as Eurolite. I'd never heard this before, which was like an asbestos fibre coated in cement. And we know that the walls were quite flimsy because there's a record of, in the Hospital Gazette, this wonderful hospital magazine that is an absolute mine of information. There's reference to someone throwing a snowball with a bit too much strength and making a hole in the wall. So that gives you some idea of how fragile the walls were. But on that point about the humour and the atmosphere in the hospital, many people commented on exactly that. They were surprised when they visited the hospital to find this atmosphere of cheerfulness, laughter, singing, and it's worth countering that with other people's descriptions of going there and responding to it in a very different way. But it was a complex place. I don't think there is one story about the First Eastern General. I've learned that there were many perspectives on it, and I tried to convey that in the film. From the sort of zealotry with which it was built, and this conviction that the open air therapies, were best, to the nurses' comments on how cold, how physically grueling it was to be working in those kinds of temperatures. And then local people's perspective. And there's just one little story that I'd like to read. There are lots and lots of stories that I would have loved to put in, particularly from the pages of the magazine, which I think gives you some real insight. But there's one story that I remember reading the first time I looked at the Hospital Gazette. And I'll read it because it's possible that you might even know the family. And I'd love that to be the case. This is good. It's just a little article from the Hospital Gazette, and it's called A Juvenile Visitor. A small boy was found by one of the kitchen staff in Burrell's Walk. He was crying and seemed very tired. On inquiry, it was found that he was Leslie Trundley of Godmanchester and was 11 years old. He had walked 16 miles to visit his brother, who was a patient in the hospital. He'd left home at 9 a.m. and followed the telegraph wires until he reached Cambridge. Having found his brother in Ward 9 and had tea with him, Leslie went to another ward where the men were very interested in him. They took his photo and gave him some money. By this time, Leslie had forgotten his fatigue and was quite prepared to walk back to Godmanchester. He said he could take it easy going back. It was thought wiser to send him back by train, and so with a taxi to the station and a train to Godmanchester, Leslie arrived home very pleased with his day's adventure. His parents and the policeman of the village were searching for him, as he'd forgotten to tell them of his day's plan. And I couldn't resist Googling Leslie Trundley to see what kind of a story there might be associated with him. He does seem to have had some connection with the railway, so it's quite possible. That there was some link there. But the Hospital Gazette, which I mentioned, which is an absolute mine of information, you can find copies of it in the Cambridge Central Library upstairs in the Cambridgeshire collection, and it really does. It does contain a huge amount of information. I mean, obviously quite heavily censored, but similar anecdotes and so forth, which really bring the hospital to life. It was a town, it was a village, it was a community for those 4 or 5 years. But then I just want to, one other voice that I didn't include in the film is that of Elfrida Tilliard, who was the daughter of a newspaper proprietor, and her father also managed the Cambridge Steam Laundry. She visited she became an author. She was a mystic, interested in all sorts of spiritual matters. She kept a diary and donated 75 volumes of it to Girton College. This is her diary entry from April 23rd, 1917, having visited the hospital. It is a vast, decorous and horrible place. I felt all the correct emotions, gratitude, pity, wonder, but most of all, this kept running in my head, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. The monstrous iniquity of it did not seem to strike people. I felt everyone, objectively, patients, doctors, visitors, were taking war as a matter of course. The unspeakable wickedness of these men having been stricken by their own brothers did not seem to them, as to me, a thing that shouted out its horror. So again, we have these opposing stories. You know, there were people who would not go near the hospital, just as there were people in the town who were more than willing to involve themselves in helping and voluntary work. So I think it's important to keep that breadth of perspective. It didn't mean one thing to everyone. Anyway, any more questions?
Apparently it was called the first Eastern Hospital, or the second Eastern.
I think so. Yes, I'm not quite sure where it was. But
the film talks about a network and the
Yes.
1908 contingency plan for hospitals. Where were they?
all over the UK, a massive network. And obviously, the first Eastern was, I think, the biggest of all of them. And they were selected really, I suppose, in the context of communications as much as anything. Closeness to ports, to railways, so forth, and also existing medical facilities. But yes, I mean, it was built very quickly. It was opened by October 1914, but the planning behind that went right back to 1908.
So were there equivalent ones on Western, Southern, Northern?
Yes, yes.
Second Eastern General Hospital, Brighton during the Great War. That's where it was.
Right.
In Brighton.
What about the research hospital?
The Cambridge Research Hospital.
Yes.
Well, there is a panel. Oh, I forgot to mention the exhibition, but in the exhibition I've tried to show that the First Eastern was not the only hospital, and all the other hospitals sort of worked alongside the First Eastern. The Cambridge Research Hospital is interesting, particularly for this project, because it's the original hospital was opened in Hartington Grove in 1905. But during the First World War, by then it had moved to Works Causeway, and it subsequently became known as the Strangeways Research Hospital. So that's the same hospital with a different name. But by the time the war broke out, it was being used for Belgian officers specifically. That was taken over by the War Office for that purpose. And they were really convalescent patients as well. But the research hospital was opened by someone called Strangeways, Dr. Thomas Strangeways. And the research that was carried out there was into diseases of, they're called special diseases, sort of arthritis and diseases, related diseases like that. I think it's called diseases of the connective tissues. So they were carrying out very specific kind of research there before the war. And then for the years of the war, it was used as a convalescent home, and then it reverted to its original use. So there's a bit of information in the exhibition about that. There were other temporary hospitals as well for the Belgians.
You said Hartington Grove. Do you mean where the Friends Meeting House is?
No, I don't. No, I think it was number 5, Antony Grove. And I don't think it exists anymore, that particular spot. Is that right? Does anyone know? Certainly, I've certainly written about it somewhere in the exhibition. But the original house, that was Strangeways' own home. He just had very few patients who would come and stay with him and live with him. And that very quickly became impractical as a hospital. So money was raised, and they basically built the house on Works Causeway. I think they moved there in about 1912, something like that, before the war.
I find it a bit surprising that they had all these plans in place. And wait, what were they expecting? Yes.
I'm afraid I don't find it surprising.
You don't?
No, I don't. I think the First War was not a surprise to many, many people.
The fear of German invasion dated for several years before that.
Yeah, and the build-up of the naval
Through
supremacy. So I think that the War Office, was looking ahead. And certainly that does explain how the hospital was able to be built so quickly. We know that the men worked day and night, between August and October, and that's why it had these temporary homes in the Leeds and then in Trinity, whilst that was being built. But they still had to get the land. And it's interesting to me that the hospital didn't close until March 1919, and that was largely, I think, due to the Spanish influenza epidemic, which just had a catastrophic effect really on the population of the world. And we know, for instance, that female mortality in Cambridge in 1919 almost doubled, and that's possibly due to the fact that so many women were caring for family members. So many women already depleted by the war were, nursing. But by March 1919, when the hospital closed, the undergraduates were coming back. you can still find peevish comments about, you know, the fact that they had lost their cricket field, they'd lost their, because apparently the turf, the land itself, the playing field on which the hospital was built, its turf had been lovingly tended since the 18th century. And it was sold. It wasn't just dug up. The turf was sold, and apparently, you know, it was an extremely popular auction. The incomparable turf. Sorry, there's one more anecdote connected with that, which is that because when the students came back, they had lost their playing field, Kings and Clare. There was a historic hockey match on the lawn outside King's College Chapel, on the back lawn. This had never happened before, and it attracted a lot of press attention to see that ancient hallowed grass that no one was even allowed to walk on being used for hockey, because they no longer had a playing field, because by now it was being lived in by townspeople as temporary council housing. So there are all these shifts in relationship between town and gown, which that's another thing that really interested me, how the hospitals shook things up and how the newest generation in 1919 who came to Cambridge, they didn't know anything about the previous use. They didn't understand the hospital in a way, and that's part of the reason why it gets forgotten, because no one owns it. No one owns its history. Sorry.
Were there any psychological patients in the first Eastern, or shell shock, or anything like that?
I've read lots of comments, you know, from the nurses, their input into, you know, the mental state of the patients, but I've never found a category of patient being referred to. And having said that, there was a lot of research happening in Cambridge into shell shock. I mean, this is where it was happening. And after the war, there was an attempt to set up a clinic, you know, the very beginnings of that, attached to Addenbrooke. So it's happening during the war, that sort of realisation, but it's not made explicit, not in anything I've read. Sarah?
What do you think about the, I suppose which would be our local hospital, the one that's on the Dairyland, that's around Carpen Road and Cherry Hinton Road, where the 1950s houses are now built? How long was that a hospital, and what kind of impact would that have had on the immediate area?
Do you mean the VD hospital?
Yeah.
Well, again, I refer you to the exhibition, because I've tried to hint at local attitudes to it. I mean, there's no doubt that it caused a furore amongst local people. Some people saw it as a real threat to the physical health and the moral health of their community. The War Office always called them military isolation hospitals. They weren't explicit about the kind of men who went there. And it's interesting to me that although you have this huge archive of photographs of the First Eastern, I haven't found a single photograph beyond the one that's on the wall there of either of the VD hospitals. And I don't know whether that's just that's a temporary lack, you know, whether those photographs will come to light. But there's certainly nothing in the Cambridgeshire archive.
No, I found 2 more.
Have you?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Because.
Oh, I get to film myself, don't I?
Hello. Anthony Carpen. My house is actually on the site of that old hospital, and I never knew that on the site of where I live. And also, if you see on the patchwork up here, the Rock Estate Dairy, and where that plane is on the same site where they landed that plane. And I was looking in the Museum of Cambridge as well for information on that military hospital, because if I turn the camera around to the map from 1927 here, you'll notice, and this is why I love old maps, by the way, and do have a look at those maps on the table. This is where the hospital is, and you can see even in 1927 there's absolutely nothing there. But if you look at the aerial photographs that were taken in just after the First World War, the original Cambridge from above, you can actually see there are Nissen huts all the way down what is now Neville Road, but none of it is officially recorded. And still pointing the camera at me. But there are actually 2 other photographs I've found in the Museum of Cambridge's archives of that military hospital. But again, trying to find information about it is actually very, very difficult. There are a couple of articles if you look on the British newspaper archives, which actually we've all got access to on the library's computers, if I'm correctly informed. And they, again, in the local newspapers at the time, they talk about some of the people or some of the soldiers who were confined to that hospital actually escaped. But one of the reasons why they were caught was because they were so easily spotted in the uniforms that they were forced to wear.
I've included
very quickly.
some references to the press accounts of because there was a lot of sort of petty thieving and plundering of orchards and theft and things, which were attributed to the soldiers who were constantly trying to escape. You know, they were effectively prisoners, and they were healthy. I mean, you know, they were strong. They weren't necessarily disabled, but they were kept supposedly under guard all the time. And there was such a shortage of manpower that, you know, there weren't enough guards, and often it was disabled soldiers who were guards. So there's plenty to find out about the hospital through the eyes of the town.
Shall we? I think some people are beginning to one more question, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. Yeah.
It's just that my mother and her sister.
Sorry.
It's just to say that my mother and her older sister used to walk right from Histon Road to the Swiss Laundry, and she did tell me they used to do all the washing from that hospital.
Yes.
There. So that was the Swiss Laundry even in those
Still
days.
going, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there's a wonderful photograph which, I don't know if it's on, no, but it was up before. The photograph of the laundry room in the First Eastern General, and you can clearly see the Swiss Laundry hamper.
Which I'd been pushed around in the Second World War by the night watchman.
You were going to tell us about the white poppy.
Yes, the white poppy, the Peace Pledge Union. Has anyone heard of the Peace Pledge Union? Yeah. I suppose the motivation for me is that I've been thinking a lot when I was doing this project and other World War I projects. I've been thinking about, you know, the purpose of the centenary for the whole of the war, really. Well, you know, what justification can there be for trawling through so much suffering, basically, and uncovering and reenacting this suffering, if you like. And I think the answer for me has to be that it can only be justified if there's some kind of transformation in our thinking or feeling or our attitudes. And I thought maybe we could just start maybe tonight with a shift perhaps in the way we think about the poppy, this red poppy that's become more and more a kind of symbol that scoops up this huge, this incredibly horrific subject of war. And I'd like to mention the white poppies because I don't think they get enough coverage, and I think now is the time to perhaps start thinking about how we remember, how we're going to go on remembering the war once the centenary is over. So the white poppies have been produced and distributed by the Peace Pledge Union since the 1930s. These were people who had lived through the First World War, who'd lost family members in that war, and foresaw the imminence of a second war. It's the oldest secular pacifist organisation in Britain, and so it began by campaigning against the militarisation of Armistice Day. It was founded by someone called Canon Dick Shepherd, who was the son of Queen Victoria's chaplain, and he started to oppose the official remembrance ceremonies and the glamorous victory balls that were being held in the 1920s. And many women were involved with the Peace Pledge Union, and one, perhaps of the most vocal, was Vera Brittain. She was a woman who got very involved from the very early days, and she called on people to attend an alternative service of remembrance in Trafalgar Square, with an emphasis on reconciliation and dedication to a peaceful future. So just to finish then, the white poppy, what does it represent? It represents remembrance for all victims of war, not just the military, but all civilian and military, and on all sides. It represents a commitment to a culture of peace, where conflicts are resolved without violence, and it challenges, or it represents a challenge to attempts to glamorise or celebrate war. So it has a sort of, obviously, a contrasting message to the red poppy, because it's aiming to foster an understanding that there are alternatives. And I feel today is a good opportunity to talk about the white poppy for that reason, because we're in the middle of a centenary. It's Remembrance Day, and the beginning of the project focused a lot on conscientious objectors who lived in this area and their contribution to the war. And although I didn't really talk about that in terms of the film, I didn't talk about those who didn't fight for moral convictions, I did want to register that that was another important way in which this neighbourhood interacted with the war, a moral objection to the war. And I hinted at that in the quotation that I gave you from Baylis' diary. So if you're interested in taking away a poppy, there's only a little bit left of Remembrance Day, but it seems to me a suitable occasion to bring attention to them. And if in future years you wanted to buy a poppy or to get hold of them, the Peace Pledge Union details are here. I got these poppies from the Friends Meeting House in Cambridge, who act as distributors.